G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and importantly a fantastic Friday. But even more importantly, I hope that you are having a fantastic Valentine's Day as well. I hope that you get some chocolates or some flowers or maybe a tomahawk steak. Now legends, as always, we have a lot to go over. Of course, we're going to look at the maps, but we can't ignore the massive news, of course. What is coming out is what the US administration is saying around negotiations. We need to look at what Europe has said, what NATO has said, where there's some things just not lining up, and also we need to look at what Ukraine is saying and how this can actually be different to what we're hearing about some of these meetings that are set to take place. And we need to talk about the reality versus what is just idealist. And there's a hell of a lot of people online at the moment, less since the US aid came down for some reason, but there's a hell of a lot of people who are absolutely in a flat spin, who haven't actually spent a day or a minute on the front lines. And there's people I talk to behind the scenes who are saying, look, it's a bit of relief. It's not how we wanted this to end at all, but at least we know it's coming to some level of conclusion, hopefully. And we spoke about the psychological impact that can have yesterday. And I also want to speak about India as a follow-up for what we said yesterday, or the day before maybe, about India and Russia and the US and getting weapons from a lot of different areas. So look, let's actually start on the maps and then we'll talk about what Trump has said, NATO and the EU. So of course we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, the red check that you're going to see, that is ground made by the Russian forces over the past 24 hours. The blue that you may see is Ukrainian advancements over the past 2 weeks, but there are no new updates for Ukrainian advancements today. So we come to, of course, now the infamous, but not as infamous as it should be, Velyka Novosilka. Why do I say that? Well, most people online absolutely had a blind eye to this, and there's still no official confirmation of this actually falling, what is incredibly disappointing for those who gave their lives in defense of this area. But we do see on the western side, large Russian advancements. Now, this is what we expected to see yesterday, this movement of about 2.1 kilometers, and Suryak did show similar to this yesterday, and he has 2 updates for us today. Now, same area, movement up past this road, moving, of course, from south to north, and then further advancement today, just in this same area. So Suryak is showing further, but typically, and it seems to just be again and again, like with this advancement, Suryak just a day or so ahead. And then we need to look on the far east. This is, of course, Velyka Novosilka, then Rozdolny, and then we come right up. And, of course, this is then where we see Rozliv, and just to the south of Rozliv, we see where this road comes up, that just this area in here has come under control of the Russian armed forces. That's what we're seeing. And that, of course, forms then the southern area of the pocket around, well, we call it the Kursk pocket, but it's becoming the Andriivka pocket at this point in time. So now let's talk then about this area. And we do see further expansion on the red check on this, both in the northern direction and easterly as well. On Suryak, he's showing that the Russian army took control over a series of positions southwest of Dashny. Now, we see where this road runs north to south. This is the road right in here. He's showing that Dashny has come under control, and further movements up through these tree lines and paddocks. There is also geo-confirmed footage of showing this same advancement as well. Now we have a second update, and we now can confirm this northerly push out of Andriivka, as well as some further westerly push. Of course, what this is doing is tightening up the pocket that is currently of Uluki, potentially Dashny, but of Constantinople as well. And could we see Russia really level out the front line here? Of course, beefing up that area on this whole western Pokrovsk front line, of course, pushing in the direction of Dnipro and Zap Oblast. So we will see where this goes in the next coming weeks or months. One thing we have to note is that the advancements around Pokrovsk have really slowed down. And we did expect that. We expect that with the weather. We expect that with the pace month on month as well. Now we have one more update on the eastern side of Pokrovsk. Of course, this Badanivka front where this intersection has come under control. I was going to say it looked slightly different shaped yesterday, but no, I'm incorrect. Let's bring this up. And we'll line up. This is the intersection. This is where this blue is being shown. Last 48 hours, Russian army took full control over the village of Vodyany Druy. So this is this area right in here. If you zoom in enough, you can see it. So he's saying that this area has come under control. Now, yesterday or potentially the day before, but I believe it was yesterday, you would have seen that I showed you up on the northeastern front. So this is above Kupiansk. I did say that Suryak's map did show that Feryvka had Russian entry, as well as further pushes on the west of Novomlinsk. Of course, we said wait out on that. Now, as is seeming, month on month, year on year, Suryak a couple of days ahead here. Now that we can confirm this, again, we only confirm this when it's multiple sources on the maps. We have pushed the north of Dovrychnia. Of course, this was shown to be under complete occupation by a DivGen map last week, and Suryak has been talking about this over the last days and weeks as well, and movement into here. So we can confirm that movement also. So let's talk about negotiations, peace process, and the divide here. And I want to talk about the worst case scenario, the worst possible outcome that could occur. Now, let's speak about why Trump thinks this war then begun. And this is something we hear a hell of a lot. Of course, NATO membership.
Yesterday were pretty accurate. I don't see any way that a country in Russia's position could allow them, just in their position, could allow them to join NATO.
So I don't see a country in Russia's position to allow a neighbouring country, in this case being Ukraine, to allow them to join NATO. And this is very similar to what we hear about if Mexico wanted to join some other military alliance outside of the US interests. How would that actually look? And just applying that over. And Trump and many others have been speaking about this, and it's interesting to hear now Trump as the president speak directly on this, saying, I can't see how Putin could actually let that occur. But then he continues to go on and say, well, the war started because of NATO entry. And this is very similar to what we saw Putin say, Putin claim, and even if you want a better example of it, breaking it down, I guess you can look at what he said with Tucker Carlson last year. I can't remember the date on that. But we do know the one big point for Putin walking away from this is he has maybe some territorial goals, but the ambition of the territory is definitely a second priority to Ukraine not joining NATO. And as long as there is ambition or promises to join NATO, Putin, I do not believe, will end the war. And that's what we're going to go over, because Mark Rutte, he's now turning back and saying, no, we never really said that they were going to join NATO. And you're like, brother, for years you've been saying an irreversible path, and I'm going to show you some evidence of this. But let's finish looking at what Trump has said.
I don't see that happening. And long before President Putin, Russia was very strong on the fact that I believe that's the reason the war started, because Biden went out and said that they could join NATO, and he shouldn't have said that. As soon as he said that, I said, you know what? You're going to have a war now, and I was right about that. This is a war that would have never happened if I were president.
So again, we hear, never would have happened if I was the president. Of course, we do see back in 2014, when Trump wasn't in power, we did see further movements as well back then, and saying that it was because of joining NATO. And like we hear from Pete Hegseth, from other members of Trump's administration, that NATO membership is off the table. But how else is this going to look? Can Europe actually backfill this? Now, this is where we get some sort of difference in what is actually happening. Now, Reuters is reporting this. Trump says US-Russian officials to meet in Munich on Friday, that Ukraine is invited, that they're having a meeting tomorrow. In Munich tomorrow. This is what Trump has said. Russia's going to be there with our people. Ukraine is also invited. By the way, not sure exactly who's going to be there from any country, but high-level people from Russia, from Ukraine, and from the United States. But it does look like, no, Ukraine will not be attending this. Dmitry Litvin, an advisor to President Zelensky, has said a common position with allies must be on the table for a conversation with the Russians. For the moment, there is nothing on the table. Discussions with the Russians are not envisaged. So, of course, this is, it's also illegal to have talks with Putin at this point in time as well. Will we see that change? We will see. He continues to say, The Ukrainian position remains unchanged. Ukraine must first speak with America. Europe must participate in any serious discussion on a real and sustainable peace. And this is where Europe is seemingly very, very pissed off, is it seems like Trump, Putin, the leaders of the two largest nuclear arsenals in the world, have gone, let's just bypass everyone else and we will just talk. Now, in my opinion, and some disagree on this, I believe this is to try and stop Russia moving closer and closer to China, due to the flow-on effects that will have for US dominance around the world. Now, let's look at this, because we reported yesterday that potentially there will be meetings in Saudi Arabia next week if at the MSC, the Munich Security Conference, this weekend, there isn't then a meeting.
Tomorrow there's a meeting in Munich, and then next week there's a meeting in Saudi Arabia, not with myself or President Putin, but with top officials, and Ukraine will be a part of it too. And we're going to see if we can end that war. That war is a horrible...
So we know Saudi Arabia, they have participated in things like POW swaps as an intermediary between Ukraine, Russia and the US. But he's saying in Saudi that there will be further meetings. But at this point in time, I have some doubt if Ukraine is willing to send people to these meetings, and laws may need to be changed. I don't think that Russia will participate if that law isn't changed. They'll participate with the US, but I think they will say, and we're not going to speak to Ukraine until that then is lifted, because we don't want in a period of time, in a decade's time, then someone to go, well, actually, that was illegal. We can nullify what was said or occurred at that. Now, let's look at what Zelensky has said. Now, this is about, of course, Trump's phone call with Putin. I don't think it was a priority that he talked to Russia first, although it's really not very pleasant. Ukraine will not accept any bilateral peace talks without our participation and that of our European partners. My concern in this will be, though, what if Trump goes, well, I'm going to speak to Putin anyway, and we are going to start working on this. The US has a hell of a lot of power. It's 80% of NATO's firepower. It is a massive amount of what Ukraine is getting supplied. Absolutely the leader in that too. And I think some more people should be more maybe respectful of that. So let's look at that. Let's look at military aid. And this is something that Pete Hegseth will go over what he has said too. So we need to look at this. Government support to Ukraine, total bilateral allocations. So we see the US is a long, long way in front. Of course, the US is the largest economy, but still the amount they've given is massive. Now, Trump disputes this figure. He says it's more around that $350 billion. I'll be very interested to see the accounting of how that is made up. But at the end of the day, regardless of how this war ends, it was the US funding from taxpayers, from aid, that saved Ukraine and slowed down the Russians, from intelligence gathering, data transfer, use of GPS, use of Starlink. It's actually funny. Everyone hates Elon Musk in the online sphere, but you could argue that he is actually the single biggest supporter here with Starlink. But anyway, it was the US that did this, that stepped in, that saved this. Now, it may not end perfectly, but that still needs to be taken into account. And maybe it is time for other nations to actually step up to the plate, not just posting on Twitter and not just speaking in Parliament, to actually step up and go, right, we need to give X amount of aid. If this is your rhetoric about existential war, maybe it's time for these other nations in here to step up to this. As Trump has said, it's on your border. We have an ocean in between. And we see this from Politico, that Russian defense spending overtakes Europe. Their military expenditure is rising so fast that it is outperforming all European countries combined, despite their effort to boost budgets and rearm. Now, this is when we take into account purchasing power parity. So $1 in the US gets you less than $1 transferred into rubles spent in Russia. Very basic of purchasing power parity. Now, as we see, Europe's combined defence spending was $457 billion, and Russia's, when you take in the PPP, was $461.6 billion. And what I'm getting at is, well, is it time for Europe to step up to the plate? And if you want me to look at, can Russia maintain this? First link in my description, there is an interview with an economist who specialises in Eastern European politics, speaking of this, and in my opinion, this is what existential war, because Russia sees this as existential as well, this is what the spending would look like, that you're at 6.7% of your gross domestic product, your GDP. You're at that much of it. So the next slide I want to show you is a lot of countries that say, or at least their rhetoric, is that this war is existential for Europe, for the EU. But their monetary commitment, and we're going to look at the GDP here, it doesn't reflect this, in my opinion. That there wouldn't be any ideas not to send that or not to mobilise and bring more money to the table. So from Politico, we take this figure of 6.7% of their GDP. Then we'll come on to these figures and we look at these are the highest of GDP of Estonia, Denmark, Lithuania, Latvia. This is the percentages though, but we see the highest being all combined at 2.5%. Remember, Russia is at 6.7%. So this is something I think that the US is not happy about, but at the same time, these countries who are most at risk, if they're saying this is existential and Russia's going to march to Brussels, well, I think it's time maybe for them to pony up. And let's have a look then at what then Pete Hegseth
certainly not a betrayal, as I said to
the question was, has the US betrayed Ukraine?
Our allies yesterday, we recognize the incredible commitment that has been made over many years, and no country, as the President Trump has pointed out, has made a larger commitment to the Ukrainian mission than the United States of America.
As per the figures, and he quotes again $350 billion mark.
$300 billion. So the United States has invested in stabilizing those front lines after the aggression of Russia. There is no betrayal there. There is a recognition that the whole world and the United States is invested and interested in peace, a negotiated peace. As President Trump has said, stopping the killing. And so that will require both sides recognizing things they don't want to.
So both sides recognizing things they don't want to. Trump wants peace, and I think that he wants to stop the bleeding that is happening in competitiveness and division as well. And of course, all of that, the main beneficiaries is going to be China and India, one of the countries we'll speak on in a second.
That's why I think the world is fortunate to have President Trump. Only he at this moment could convene the powers that be to bring peace, and that's a welcome sign.
So that peace will come and the killing will stop. And like I said, there's a lot of very loud people who are incredibly disappointed by this, and fair enough. But a lot of people have given so much. But there's also a lot of people behind the scenes who just want to see peace. If you were to go down to a cafe and ask someone right now, we're about to enter the fourth year of the war, what do you think? A lot of people, I think the majority of people would go, look, I think it's time that we made peace. It's expensive, not only money, but it's unbelievably expensive of the lives that are being poured into here. And I'll reiterate what I said yesterday, is I agree with Professor Mearsheimer when he said at the end of 2022, that was the high point after Kharkiv and Kherson offensives. And then after we saw that when Ukraine was the best trained, best motivated and best equipped of the 2023 counter-offensive, and that Russia was in the worst possible spot at that point in time and having to mobilise and all this, that was when these professionals or claimed professionals should have gone, this is probably going to be the best point it is, because now we're in a worse situation, but at least another few 100,000 people down the line. The horrible, horrible situation. But I think many people just want to see peace, and in many people's calculation that they are happy to then give up some of this. And I know that's a very hard thing, but like people say, he believes that is the realistic outcome of this, not just idealistic. Now, we need to look at, because Ukraine doesn't want to give up anything. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine posted this on their Twitter of the entirety of Ukraine, including Crimea, of 628 kilometres square. So what will we see here? I'm unsure. Even if we see the US and Russia make some deal, US support go, and Ukraine and Zelensky continue to push the war, that I believe would have catastrophic outcomes. Europe has shown, and other figures have shown, they're not committed, nor do they have the industrial capacity to backfill what the US would leave. Russia is spending more on defence than the EU combined. That's why I showed you those figures. It's an important thing that if Trump sees that Putin is willing to come to the table and that Zelensky or Ukraine or Europe is not, what is the US's next move? Now, let's look over what, of course, NATO Secretary Mark Rutte has said.
Listen, in Washington again, NATO committed to future NATO membership for Ukraine. But it has never been agreed that whenever peace talks would start, that peace talks would end anyway and always and definitely with NATO membership.
It's never been agreed that when peace talks end, that it would have NATO membership for Ukraine.
That has never been agreed.
Never been.
It could be, but it never was that clearly stated. What I consistently have said is we have to make sure that whatever the outcome is, we have to make sure that Vladimir Putin will never, ever try again to attack.
And I vehemently disagree with this. I think most people had the idea that whenever peace talks took place, that it would end with Ukraine joining NATO. As Mr. Rutte has said himself, that he reiterated again and again that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership. And I think this flipping here does really undermine a lot of what has been said. And this is just one time of many, many times things like this have been said. Now, the United Kingdom's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who's awfully popular at the moment, has reiterated on February 13th, so yesterday, Ukraine's irreversible path to NATO membership, saying, "My position is the NATO position." This was discussed at the summit that we had last year in Washington, where it was agreed amongst all NATO members that there should be an irreversible path of Ukraine to NATO membership. So this is what I get at. There's this real divide between what is being said from the US administration and what a lot of European partners believe and or saying. And I think Mr. Hegseth is on that. There's this idea of idealism, but we need to see realism of this. So will we see Europe step up to the plate? Like I said yesterday, and I'll reiterate again, if we're ever going to see Europe step up, now is the time. If we're ever going to see all these tens of thousands of people online who are screaming for the destruction of Moscow and Russia and for this line to push back, then there's never a better time for these people to step up and be armed and trained by Europe as well to go and fight in this said to be existential war. So what will we see? But I want to get at what the title is probably of this video, because it's good clickbait, around, don't hate the player, hate the game, around the worst possible outcome. And this is where I want to lead from this, that Viktor Orban, of course, Prime Minister of Hungary, Zelensky's second least favourite person behind Mr. Putin, but of course a conservative leader of a country within the EU and NATO, he has said this, and he reshared the statement that we shared yesterday, and this is being shared from the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Vice President of the European Commission, Kaja Kallas, that Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity are unconditional from the countries of France, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, and the UK. And Orban has reshared this. This declaration is a sad testament of bad Brazilian leadership. While President Trump and President Putin negotiate on peace, EU officials issue worthless statements. You can't request a seat at the negotiating table, you have to earn it through strength, good leadership, and smart diplomacy. The position at Brussels to support killing as long as it takes is morally and politically unacceptable. And what I'll say is if NATO and or the EU divide, they're in serious trouble. I actually think they're in serious trouble anyway, but if there's further division, that is really, really bad news. So I saw a tweet at least along these lines. I can't find it again, but it was very close to this, that Europe should create its own security alliance without the US, without Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, and Romania, depending on their election outcome. Of course, Calin Georgescu, it's been really illegal for him to continue to run. Just before he was about to win the leadership of Romania, they found that there was allegedly Russian influence there, and the election stopped. They're rerunning the election, and it's still going through the courts if he can run or not. So let's take into account, let's say he has won, okay, then Romania, we know he doesn't want to continue supplying to Ukraine, so it would have a security alliance with Ukraine in it, but without the US, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria. The original tweet said Switzerland, but Switzerland's neutral. Let's not talk about that. And what I will say is I believe this is the worst possible outcome that could happen. Okay, so I want to show you this map. As I've discussed, countries that are not major nuclear powers and are not self-sufficient in terms of economic trade, military capabilities, and energy, it is clear that such nations will need to be part of an alliance for trade and security. That's just how the modern world is. If you're not a major player backed by nuclear weapons, backed by self-sufficiency or self-sufficiency through diversity, I'll talk about that in a second, you need to be part of an alliance. You need to be part of this for trade, security, energy. If these countries were to leave the EU or NATO, they would have to seek alternatives. These countries are not big enough to be self-sufficient. The most readily available option would be Russia. Russia can lure these nations, of course, with promises of cheap energy and protection of its nuclear umbrella. The EU can only function effectively as it remains, cohesive and united. Of course, this is not taking into account other problems around further access into Eurasia, China's expansion. So what am I talking about here? Well, what I've said is that if we see NATO, EU division here, if we saw some other alliance or whatever, or these countries look to leave, theoretically, how would this then look? Because they're going to fall into an orbit. You have to fall into an orbit these days. Ukraine know this better than anyone. They're outside of NATO, they're outside of another military alliance, and what happened? They were invaded. Okay? So why other countries, that's why Finland and Sweden joined NATO. You can't not be part of something now. So, but how would this look? Well, this is Russia by this red border down here. Now, I've drawn this white border of where is the occupied territory at the moment. Of course, we have Kaliningrad, and let's point out the countries that we're speaking of to be excluded from something like this. So you'd have then Austria, Slovakia, of course, Hungary, potentially Romania. Let's not take into account Switzerland. So could we see this? And this, I think, is the worst possible outcome. That the war in Ukraine could jeopardize EU and NATO. And this would be a turbo boost, and it already is actually, to Putin and Xi Jinping's multipolar worldview of what they want. I believe a lot of leaders here need to be very cautious of letting the defence of a non-NATO and non-EU state undermine the world's most powerful alliances, which are EU and NATO. I think they need to be very careful of something like this happening, because this is a worst case scenario. Now, I've put Serbia in this because they would probably be, if these other countries were, we know where the relationships are there. Turkey, that would be a very interesting one to see where that actually held up if there was a huge change here. And of course, I've drawn an arrow down to this is where Iran sits. I probably should have zoomed out a little bit more. And of course, Transnistria in here. So this is like the worst possible case. I think it is, first and foremost, should be maintaining these economic trade alliance of the EU, military alliance of NATO. First and foremost, that needs to stay, because if that starts crumbling, if cracks start opening further, of which have already appeared, you may end up with either other alliances being formed or Hungary or Slovakia just going, well, we're not seeing eye to eye. We are being pulled somewhere by Russia. And we already see that with Orban and Putin with energy. So this is not like Europe has been in a state of flux forever, basically. Don't think that where it is now is just an absolute constant. And this is the worst possible outcome for the Western world of this war. And the best possible, if Putin's movements into Ukraine, the invasion into Ukraine, caused this sort of rift and this amount of reduction in hegemony, and China, of course, an ally of Russia, although no formal military alliance, and Russia, they end up by just by division in here, becoming then larger powers in a multipolar world, or leaders of that. This is a real threat. And what I'll say is I think that what people like about Trump and what people don't like about other leaders is looking inwardly first rather than outward. Now, we've reported about India, and of course, India with weapon systems. And the reason the air show is on at the moment in India is not to show the Su-27 doing flips and pretty stuff in the air. It's not for that. UAC is trying to sell that bloody thing. During a press conference with the United States President Donald J. Trump, the Indian Prime Minister Modi, President Trump, is committed to supplying India with US-made F-35 fighter jet. Recently, the F-35 paid a visit to India alongside the Su-57 as per this photo. So, of course, India, they're looking for a 5th generation fighter aircraft. Of course, both of these aren't perfect. We see a lot of F-35s falling out of the air, and we see very few, well, this is actually a T-50, but we see very few Su-57s as well, and there are questions at least raised about its stealth capabilities and other capabilities, but again, no one really knows beyond just people on TikTok talking about that. People say we haven't seen it in Ukraine, and it's like, well, either it's not being used or the stealth is working, and that's where it's like, well, it could be one or the other, and we don't really know, because if it's not seen, either the stealth is really good or it's not being used, and there's not that many produced. Of course, Russia cannot produce the amount of Su-57s that the West can of the JSF, the Joint Strike Fighter, of the F-35. But we spoke of this earlier. This is what Russia's trying to do, of export this system. We will see what actually occurs here. India is a really, really interesting country. One, the population is insane. Do not let the TikTok, Instagram videos, of the C-17 dropping soap on India, don't let that take away from the global dominance that India could have in the future. We know population decline is a huge problem for all the other major players. And I wanted to share this again. When we're speaking about independence, sovereignty, self-sufficiency, nuclear powers, as we spoke of before, that countries have to be part of some alliance if they're not a nuclear power, self-sufficient, or self-sufficiency through diversity. India, this is a good example sent across from someone behind the scenes. India is probably the best example of a non-superpower sovereign state. They're not energy interdependent, but import a balance of their energy from both Middle Eastern nations and Russia. For defence, they have a fairly significant local military-industrial complex and complement that with a fairly balanced blend of European, American and Russian weapon systems. With respect to trade, they trade with a fairly wide cross-section of trading partners and are part of both SWIFT and BRICS settlement systems. So you see this through the diversity of that you can't impact it too much. So while it remains possible for one side or the other to threaten to withdraw X interaction with India, they can always maintain the option to simply pivot into the arms of the other side. The US doesn't want to push India closer to the BRICS nations, and as the BRICS nations don't want to drive India closer to America. A fairly civil and balanced equilibrium is maintained whereby India is more or less able to establish its own foreign and domestic policy without fear of drastic aggression from the outside nations. This is the best example, I think, of the sovereignty through diversity or neutrality approach. And we saw only earlier this week or last week, I shared that India was buying multi-billion-dollar contracts of Russian anti-ship missiles. And we see air defense systems, all of this as well, that there's this real mix. And this is this sovereignty through diversity or neutrality approach, which is very interesting here. This is one of the issues with cutting off the Russian gas to Europe. Now, of course, what you do is you undermine Russia to be able to have another revenue stream of their energy coming in. But also what you've done is you've given up some of your sovereignty through diversity and neutrality, because now you're reliant on US arms and US energy through, say, LNG for a lot of nations. Therefore, the US can have then drastic impact, and the countries don't have a balanced equilibrium on their nations when it comes to things like tariffs, and that you can become an arm of the US. That we see a lot of people saying today, and this is where I go into this, the worst possible outcomes, and competitiveness is where people go, well, we should, tariff everything from the US. Well, where do you think that energy is now coming from? Where do you think that defense is now coming from? And these moves have really reduced, in peacetime, no one worries about sovereignty. It's all kumbaya around the fire. But if things really start to heat up, which likely it could, next thing you're fully reliant on the US for energy and military and trade, a lot of problems can start. And it's just really interesting to see this with India. And I'm not surprised at all if Modi does go with the F-35 over the Su-57. There's a number of reasons. There's reasons both ways too. But we could see this to try and have this diversity, neutrality approach to have their own real independent foreign affair domestic policies as well. It'd be very interesting to see then where air defence comes in India as well and how it stands up to these fighters. We'll never know. But I just thought that was something interesting and a bit of a kick in the nuts for United Aircraft Company. But as far as actually signed off, I don't really know at this point in time. Maybe the Russians will sweeten the deal because India will likely just get a very export variant of the F-35. Maybe the Russians can sweeten it a bit more with something on a Su-57. I don't know. Outside of that, will it be cheaper? Will it whatever? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what India actually go with. That I think that will give us the best answer to those who say the F-35 is a shitbox, Su-57 is a shitbox. They're both fucking not a shitbox, trust me. Very, very capable fighters, incredibly capable. But it'll be interesting to see actually what India go with through their own testing and their own research too. We will see. Legends, you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.